When we think about political conflict, reform, and development, there are different types of political conflict, and we can think broadly in terms of two types of conflict. One is sovereignty contesting forms of conflict. Think of it as conflict against the state, when people challenge the state. Frontier regions were seen as sites of exceptional imperial rule, right? These were exceptional institutional rule because typically in these places, you had more exceptional legal, administrative, and political arrangements. These were what historians describe as liminal spaces. These are the spaces where the administrative border ends right at the end of the settled districts, and then the political border ends after the FATA. So these liminal spaces were actually imperial spaces. These were spaces where citizens were what historians describe as imperial objects.
We also have with us to speak on the same topic, Dr. Rinchan Ali Mirza. Dr. Mirza is working as Assistant Professor of Economics at the School of Economics, University of Kent. Dr. Mirza's areas of academic interest are economic history, development economics, political economy, economics of religion, institutions, applied econometrics, migration studies, and health economics. He has also published in top academic journals, generated significant research funding, presented at prestigious conferences, cultivated co-authorships with academics at high-ranking UK, US, and European universities, and designed modules on development, economics, and economic history at undergraduate and postgraduate levels. Welcome, sir. So the format will be that we will continue with the talk, which will be followed by the Q&A session from the audiences. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation. It's always a great pleasure to come back to PIDE. When I was a student at Qaid-e-Azam University in the economics department, we always used to come to PIDE for consulting journals. And in those days, you had very specific journal issues, and the one that you would need would not be there. Somebody had taken it. These days, you have access to all the nice JSTOR journals. Okay, so this is joint work with my co-author, Professor Rinchan Ali Mirza, who's a professor at Kent University, and he's originally from Gilgit-Baltistan. So he's particularly keen to meet with students from GB. And it's also joint work with our colleague from Qaid-e-Azam University now at IBA, Fazlur Rahman, who actually hails from the Northwest frontier, particularly the FATA area. What I want to do today is provide you a preview of the big idea that we want to explore, present to you some empirical results, and perhaps give you a sense of the type of methodology that economists work with. I guess quite a lot of you would be students here. So that would be a good exposure. And then perhaps launch into a discussion of why this is relevant for thinking about reform and development. So the basic storyline before I get into the presentation is that when we think about political conflict, reform, and development, there are different types of political conflict, and we can think broadly in terms of two types of conflict. One is sovereignty contesting forms of conflict. Think of it as conflict against the state, when people challenge the state. The other is more sovereignty neutral form of conflict that takes place through political institutions. We are going to have elections soon, and a lot of the conflict there, competition would be through institutions of conflict management. So the story we are going to tell you is about the FATA region, the federally administered tribal areas. The story is about sovereignty contesting forms of violence where people rise up through insurgency against the state. But the analytical apparatus that we will present will be relevant for understanding Pakistan as a whole. And so the idea would be to provide you these results and then launch into a discussion of how this might be relevant for Pakistan. Now, I realize that by 3:45, your buses will have to leave. So I will try, and maybe Rinchan, you can discipline me for about 25, 30 minutes, and then let's have more Q&A because I'm more interested in what people will have to contribute. And Rinchan, please feel free to interject, and he'll be here for Q&A as well. Okay, so the title for this paper comes from a book by Benjamin Hopkins. It's called Ruling the Savage Periphery. And he talked about a set of institutional practices that he described as frontier governmentality. This was a rule of difference, the way in which in the late 18th and early 19th century, late 19th and early 20th century, many of the colonial powers created exceptional institutional arrangements to rule their frontier territories. And he described these set of practices as frontier governmentality. Now, what this institutional category meant was that frontier regions were seen as sites of exceptional imperial rule, right? These were exceptional institutional rule because typically in these places, you had more exceptional legal, administrative, and political arrangements that were unique to the frontier spaces. How were they exceptional? They were exceptional in three different ways. One is that there was very thin presence of the colonial state. So if you're thinking about a sort of non-frontier areas, you will have, some deputy commissioner, you would have some local government institutions, you would have particular kinds of property rights institutions. But when it comes to the frontier regions, you have very thin presence of the colonial state. The second way was that there were very few formal institutions of conflict management. What are formal institutions of conflict management? You can think of those as, for example, courts, judiciary, electoral politics. These are institutions of conflict management that mediate conflict in society. Instead, what these regions had was more delegated power to the elites, right? So the tribal Maliks would have a lot more power. They will work under the supervision of the colonial state officials, but they had a lot more leeway to make decisions. So in a way, this was a form of indirect rule. All over the world, wherever the British went, they set up systems of indirect rule, that is ruling through elites. But in the frontier regions, this was a step ahead because in a way, the colonial state shared its power for coercion, and which meant that even the monopoly of violence was restricted. So these spaces are typically described as areas of parallel sovereignty, partial sovereignty. The state doesn't have full sovereignty in those regions, right? They share the sovereignty with the local officials. The second aspect about these regions is that they are sort of hybrid institutional arrangements. Some presence of the state and the rest delegated to the locals. And if you look at the cartographic distinction in the Northwest frontier, the British created a distinction between what they described as settled areas of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and the frontier tribes, the frontier agencies. Now, this line, as many colonial officials described, was a line where suddenly, there was a sharp discontinuity. As you move from the settled districts to the frontier agency, suddenly there is the state's writ immediately weakens, right? The presence of the state immediately weakens. So that distinction is important to keep in mind. Now, obviously, why would colonizers set up these exceptional institutional arrangements in these places? There's a lot of literature that talks about, the colonial state facing greater resistance in these regions. The colonial state might find it not very profitable because there's hardly any cultivation, very limited cultivation, limited potential for taxation. So the costs of extending the state authority in these regions was relatively high. And as we will argue that these spaces were not just restricted to this particular part of British India. These were what historians describe as liminal spaces. These are the spaces where the administrative border ends right at the end of the settled districts, and then the political border ends after the Fatah. So these liminal spaces were actually imperial spaces. These were spaces where citizens were what historians describe as imperial objects, right? Objects of state action rather than subjects. Because with subjects, you still have to provide some electoral representation, you have to provide some services. There's some two-way relationship. You don't have that kind of two-way relationship. So state-society relationship is more fraught in these spaces. So what you find is that the
this rule of difference actually was replicated in large parts of the world. And Benjamin Hopkins talks about this system of frontier administration expanded on a large cosmopolitan canvas. In fact, many of the imperial administrators exported this practice to other parts of the world wherever the British were facing similar situations. So if you look at Kenya's northern frontier with the Somali land, you had the Special Districts Administrative Ordinance, much like the Frontier Crimes Regulation. In Pakistan's northwest, India's northeast, you have the Chin Hill regulations. In Iraq's Basra Vilayat, you had the Tribal Civil and Criminal Disputes Regulation. A lot of these exceptional institutional arrangements are therefore not just unique to the FOTA region. Variants of it existed in other parts as well. And you have these maps that show you, these type of sharp cartographic distinctions that were not just geographic distinctions, but they were also institutional distinctions in the sense that the moment you cross the boundary, there is a very different institutional arrangement. You effectively enter into a thin line of administration where there's an institutional void. There are hardly any institutions of conflict management. What this paper does is to propose a new hypothesis. It says that frontier administration, this frontier governmentality, this rule of difference, has important implications for the study of conflict. In fact, Benjamin Hopkins in his book talks about this aspect. So how do I click on this? And Rinchan, maybe you could click on literature 1. So there is a book, for example, by Adnan Nasimullah at King's College. He's from Pakistan. And he talks about how this spatial framework of governance diversity, by which he means to say that there are uneven landscapes of state authority. In some regions, state has more authority, other regions have less, actually has a lot of implication for thinking about the politics of conflict. He also talks about how violence occurs across uneven landscapes of state authority. And if you were to click on literature 2, again, Benjamin Hopkins in his book, Ruling the Savage Periphery, Frontier Governance and the Making of the Modern State, speaks of the long history of violence and how these arrangements are important for understanding the long history. The lasting legacies of frontier governmentality include poverty, political disenfranchisement, marginalization, and above all, violence. Now, what we argue in this paper is that frontier administration will not necessarily lead to more conflict per se. In fact, frontier rule can ensure social order for very long periods of time. However, frontier rule is more prone to conflict in the face of shocks, because whenever frontier administration is faced with a shock, and if the primary pillar of frontier rule, which are tribal elites, if once they're eliminated, there is hardly any institutional structure to create social order. So it's more fragile. It can provide peace for long periods of time, but it's more fragile in the face of shocks. And why is it more fragile? I mean, it's more fragile because there's a big literature out there on these hybrid areas, which shows how this sort of rule in borderland regions has more fluid and unstable character, right? Because it requires constant bargaining between different parties. And such institutional orders are therefore more vulnerable to conflict in the face of shocks because the statehood itself is more negotiable and typically mediated through elites. Now, there's a part of the presentation that is very technical. It requires more detailed sort of interaction. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to provide you a broad idea of how we collect the data, how we demonstrate our hypothesis, provide evidence on our hypothesis. What we do is we actually utilize this historical boundary that you can easily obtain through historical maps that differentiated the settled districts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa from the frontier tribal agencies. And so it's a highly granular analysis that is not all Pakistan per se. It just looks at that area around that historical boundary. And we then compile highly fine-grained data on conflicts. From the global terrorism database, we can get conflict on 10 by 10 kilometer grid cell level. And we can then analyze how there's a difference in conflict in the face of a big shock in areas that are just outside that historical border versus just inside that border, i.e. within the frontier tribal agencies. So if the greater historical exposure to frontier rule affects contemporary conflict incidents against the state, because remember, our argument is about sovereignty contesting forms of conflict, where conflict is targeted against the state. And we argue that this conflict is really activated after the 9/11. So I'll walk you through through various bits, but before we start, maybe it's a good idea to provide an overall sketch of our argument. The sketch of our argument goes as follows. Frontier governance has two, or you could argue even three, interrelated set of effects. One is that the state-society relationship here is very fraught because the state is an alien construct for them. Therefore, there's limited trust in state institutions, and there are very limited avenues for formal institutions of conflict management. Obviously, there are tribal elites, they mediate disputes, but formal institutions of conflict management, such as courts, judiciary, electoral politics, are absent in these regions. Now, what happens is that this ensures social order, but the 9/11 shock created a grievance against the state in two ways. Firstly, the war was highly unpopular all over Pakistan, but particularly in the frontier areas and in KP. The second is that the war induced, on US insistence, for the Pakistani military to move into the frontier areas. Firstly, just as a way to dominate the space. They did not carry out any actions. They've just tried to control the border. And the sheer presence of the military itself led to a rise in grievances. Now, frontier rule creates an over-reliance on elite intermediation. And that means that there was a vulnerability to shocks. And as this grievance turned into an insurgency, as there were attacks, the state responded to it through military operations, drone strikes, and so on and so forth. And then there was elimination of these tribal elites who were the central pillar of this rule. Once there was a targeted attack on these tribal Maliks, the entire structure basically was brought to the ground. So that's the main argument we want to argue. So the story is very similar to what Danny Roderick describes in his paper on growth collapses, where he talks about, there are lots of states that are hit with shocks, but some states have weak institutions. They don't have institutions of conflict management. So you find greater growth collapses in those spaces. I think I've already explained this to you. And I think to this audience, it's not news. There's a Jaga system in place. There's very limited presence of the state. And these institutional arrangements differed from the settled district. So I think I've kind of explained that point already. What we do here is use a technique which is very common in economics these days. Those who study economics know that identification is a big issue. You want to ensure that you compare the comparables, that you control for confounding factors, and that the result is well identified. So a key technique we use for this is that we compare spatial units that are very close to each other. So imagine this historical border. On one side of the border, you have the settled districts. On the other side are the frontier agencies. So areas that are very close to that border should be very similar in terms of the underlying characteristics, like in their topography, elevation, rainfall, social structure, right? Most of the things are likely to be very similar. But if you find a real discontinuity, then that means that could be attributed to that historical border and the differential institutional arrangement that existed on both sides. So this is a standard regression discontinuity specification. I won't go into much detail on that. As I've already explained, we use the historical data to define a border. You can then create that border using the GIS software. The conflict data, very detailed database on from the Global Terrorism Database. Again, it's available publicly, and you can download the data by with a high level of granularity. So we actually download the data for 10 by 10 kilometer grid cell level, at Rinchan and Faiz are now working 5 by 5 kilometers as well. We get a lot of different controls because you have to show balance of different factors across both sides, because the identification is based on those other unobservables varying smoothly across the border. So we collected data on ruggedness, topography, slope, precipitation, temperature. We also collect data on historical conflict, because if those regions were more susceptible to violence in the past, that could also drive these differences. Pre-frontier rule population density, etc. This is the study area, so you could easily see. Rinchan, correct me if I make any mistake in the precise description. This is basically a 20 kilometer or 10 kilometer, 50 kilometer border segments, I think these are. And that means we really compare the results within the same border segment, and we control for what economists would do is border segment fixed effects. We can explain that in more detail, but just in the interest of time and the overall discussion, I'll abstain from those more technical details. But that's the study area. That means we are not comparing all of Pakistan. We are really comparing areas around the border, that historical border, areas that are in settled districts versus those that are in frontier agencies, just inside or outside the border. Here is some basic description of the data, and as is visible, there is a visible difference in conflict incidents against the state. That is to say that areas just on the left of the border, which are the frontier agencies, there's higher level of conflict incidents against the state versus areas that are just outside the border, that is in settled districts. Through the spatial representation, you could look at conflict incidents, you can look at people who are killed in these conflicts, those who are injured, or just overall conflict incidents. And the way to think about this plot, again, is areas that are just inside the frontier rule border versus areas that are just outside. And you could see there's a real discontinuity as you move just outside the frontier area. These are the settled districts of KP that are adjacent to just inside the frontier area. There is a jump in the incidence of conflict. So there's a clear evidence that there's a higher conflict incidence against the state as you move to the frontier regions. The same result holds if you were to think about the number of deaths, if you were to think about number of injuries, similar results. We also show for identification purposes that a lot of the unobservable factors or characteristics that might capture these unobservable features very smoothly across the border. So it is not the case that these regions, we know, for example, the historical documents clearly tell us that as you move from the settled districts or settled regions to frontier, the elevation increases, slightly more hilly areas. But obviously, when you restrict the analysis to areas just inside and just outside the border, those differences are not statistically significant. So it's not that those underlying geographic differences are driving these results. We are really comparing the comparables, as they say. We've got a number of plots that we can show. Maybe you could click on one of these, Rinchan, on temperature, precipitation, let's say pre-FR population density. So the idea would be, maybe these regions had higher population density, and population density is a proxy for economic growth way back in time. Now there are a lot of historical sources that can provide you data from pre-colonial period, and you could see that there is no difference. I mean, there's a slight difference, but it's not statistically significant because the confidence intervals are overlapping. So you can show through these balance tests that the difference that we are interested in is really the difference that is deriving the results rather than other factors. Precipitation, for example, because precipitation can shape agricultural productivity. It could determine patterns of incomes, so on and so forth. So those are not the drivers in this analysis. Okay, we do a lot of different types of robustness tests, which I won't go through. What's the story there? We know that these regions have had more conflict, but the interesting part of the paper, in my opinion, is about temporal dynamics. And it relates to my initial hypothesis that frontier rule does not necessarily predict conflict per se. It is more, it predicts, it is more prone to conflict in the face of shocks. And that is very visible from this plot, which basically decomposes the data and plots these conflict incidents in the entire sample period, which is 1970 all the way to 2018. And what's interesting is that these are coefficients. All these points are coefficients in a kind of what we would call an event study plot, whereas frontier rule, whether or not frontier rule interacted with year. And these are averages, exactly. And so the big takeaway from this plot is that there's hardly any difference in conflict incidents between the two regions until the 9/11 period. After the 9/11, you see a statistically significant difference emerges, i.e. in frontier regions, a lot more conflict. And it peaks in about 2012, a 10 to 14 period, and declines a little bit after that. Obviously, there were military operations taking place during this time, but the difference, even at the end of the period, remains quite strong. So it's really a post 9/11 story. And what was happening in post 9/11 is therefore important for us. Our argument is that the 9/11 represented a universal shock to grievance against the state. And we can show you statistics from all over Pakistan, as well as within KP, that the war on terror was extremely unpopular throughout Pakistan, but particularly in KP, and that led to a rise in grievances. However, this all-pervasive rise in anti-state sentiment only leads to a discontinuous rise in violence in frontier areas. And we argue that this is primarily because these areas did not have those institutions of conflict management that could mediate this conflict, that could channelize those grievances. And obviously, we are going to talk a little bit about its relevance in our times today as well. We also show that the residents of frontier rule areas actually had lower trust in state. If you could just click on the table, we show survey level data to show that if you're a resident of an FR region, you have a low trust in parliament, low trust in district court, high court, supreme court, so very limited trust in state institutions, which we also find today as we speak. Then if you look at avenues for conflict management, it is very clear, particularly for this audience, it won't be a surprise that if you're a resident of FR, frontier rule area, you have more interaction with your tribal local tribal elites rather than your M&A and FTA, etc. before enfranchisement was introduced in the frontier areas. Okay, maybe you could click back. And so the final piece of evidence is that we provide a specific mechanism for how this frontier rule is disrupted in the wake of 9/11. And this happens primarily through the assassinations of tribal elites. So, Rinchan, if you could just show the plot. So this is the result, which is basically, we show that there is a discontinuity in attacks against tribal elites. So as the insurgency took hold, tribal elites became the target of these assassinations, and they were systematically targeted. Every time a tribal member is assassinated, obviously it leaves a vacuum. It leaves an institutional void, which is very difficult to fill. And in fact, as we speak, in Pakistan as well, at this moment, there's a massive institutional void. Right? So that's why this paper is about frontier, but it gives you a way to think about these issues at a larger level. This plot is an event study plot, which basically tells us the first time a tribal elder is attacked or assassinated. This one is attack, right? The first ever attack that ever takes place against a tribal elder, and that's this point, for example. The period after it, immediately, I mean, obviously there is still a trending upwards, right? So there's violence. But the first time a tribal elder comes under attack, it leads to much higher levels of violence, right? So in the same grid cell. So this is grid cell analysis, 10 by 10 kilometer grid cell. If there is a tribal elder attacked in a grid cell, there would be more violence. It triggers, it unleashes more violence, significantly more violence in that grid cell afterwards. Maybe you could, yep. So this obviously chimes well with a lot of historical, contextual literature around that time. So Nassimullah himself talks about the disruption of frontier rule. He talks about the centrality of this disruption of frontier rule that lay at the heart of political disorder, political order in Afata, is responsible for the nature and extent of conflict. And why? Because these institutions of conflict management create the regular means through which state-society relationship is governed, right? Through which social elites are able to negotiate. And in fact, if you were to look at other insurgencies, let's say in Africa, we find a similar pattern whereby as soon as local chiefs or local elites who are central to the maintenance of social order are eliminated, it leads to a sudden increase in violence. In fact, there's a Reuters report on that subject, and there's a very nice quote there about if you want maximum disorder, you kill the chief. If the agenda is to replace the state, killing the village chief is just the beginning of the process. Now, in our revised paper, we have a lot more results that deal with other kinds of explanations. So somebody might argue, look, these regions were witnessed military operations, and indeed military operations start in 2008, but they really reach a peak in 2012-14 period. There were drone strikes in these regions. So what we show is, you have now data on drone strikes, highly fine-grained data. If you were to remove those grid cells from our analysis, the results hold. Similarly, for military operations, we argue that military operations were preceded already by an uptick in conflict. So both military operations and drone strikes were endogenous response of the state to the rise in militancy, which further increased violence. But they were not the original drivers of violence, but obviously they increased violence further. We also look at spillover from Afghanistan, because somebody might argue, look, frontier regions are right next to Afghanistan. What is this just a story about spillover? And again, in the paper, we provide many tests as well as arguments to rule that out, or to argue that, there's obviously going to be some spillover. You cannot fully rule it out, but that's not the prime driver, we argue, in this paper. So I think I'll end here, and maybe Rinchan, if you have anything to add, otherwise we'll do in the Q&A session. I think the big story we're trying to paint here is that when we think about conflict, we know for a fact that borderlands are more prone to conflict, whether it's Sudan, whether it's northern Nigeria, whether it's parts of Algeria, parts of Iraq, in Africa, Boko Haram and Shabab militancy, etc. Such militancy typically takes hold in frontier areas and borderlands. And we know for a fact that borderlands are more prone to conflict, right? And they have more prone to conflict in the wake of the 9/11 wars. We don't know well why these regions are more prone to conflict. And one reason we highlight, which is important, is the differential institutional arrangement that these areas have been subjected to. These areas were subjected to what the colonial archives described as a rule of difference. Very differential institutional rule, or exceptional institutional rule, right? Which is different from the rest of the territories, and greater reliance on local tribal elites for maintaining social order, excluding these people from institutions of conflict management, which then triggers sovereignty contesting forms of conflict, right? So only in the face of shocks, obviously, because these regions can provide social order for long periods of time, as I've argued before, but they are more vulnerable, because once you remove those tribal elites, there's nothing that could withstand the shock. Now, this, I think, is an important argument, and as a social scientist, I'm always fascinated by, when you combine history, data, deep explanation, it gives you perspectives that otherwise are very difficult to develop. So perhaps it could be slightly controversial, but just to stoke your curiosity and imagination and the interest of social science knowledge. If we think about what is happening in Pakistan at the moment, if you think about May 9, for example, I follow Twitter, I look at some of the programs, I'm worried about my country as well, but I've seen this complete absence of any discourse. On May 9/11 May 9 is always seen as or May 7, whatever it was, May 9 is always seen as a kind of rule of law or law and order incident, which obviously was a horrible incident. People attacked the state installations. Nobody can ever approve that. It's a horrible thing. But what is driving that? In entire public discourse, there was a complete absence of a genuine effort to understand the deep drivers of what is happening. And I think we believe, in our own humble way, we are trying to understand that this idea is actually relevant for understanding our country. For example, prior to May 9, you have all the institutions of conflict management, media, judiciary, political institutions. They're compromised, they're controlled. And then that basically invites reaction, that invites sovereignty contesting forms of violence, that attacks against the state. And the condition that Pakistan is going through at the moment is again very similar. It's an institutional void. Void you have, the more likely it is that you will have state-society relationships that are fraught. You are more likely to have sovereignty contesting forms of violence, right? And different types of violence are more likely to take hold, right? When you undermine politics, you undermine institutions of conflict management. So hopefully this provides you some food for thought, but we are very happy to talk more about reform, development, what does it mean in terms of a conflict. While reading of these historical accounts, I felt that what FATA's role was within British North India. Pakistan is a similar imperial space in the larger committee of nations, right? It is a kind of an interesting description of that. Because we have exceptional institutional arrangements, we have rule by exception, we have collective punishments, right? One of the key things about FATA was that there was idea of collective punishment. If if there's some raiding or robbery or any threat to social order, you may be involved in that, but then your family will have to be punished for that, right? The entire tribe will have to be punished for that. So the idea of collective punishment, the idea of ruling this territory as an imperial space, as a space where individuals, citizens do not have rights, they are imperial objects, they're objects of state action rather than subjects, is something that extends beyond. It helps us understand a lot of liminal spaces, which in the larger scheme of things, Pakistan is a liminal space, is a frontier liminal space that lies between India and the larger West Asia. The type of institutions that will be set up in such states are always going to be institutions that serve larger imperial objectives rather than those. But I can continue talking more. I'm passionate about this issue, but let's open the floor for discussion and have more interaction with Rinchan as well. Please.
Thank you very much. This is something close to my research and close to my heart. Sorry, Shahid Mahmood, I'm a research fellow at PIDE. ये एक मेरा area of research भी है. Off and on इसको मैं touch भी करता हूँ, and I worked on it. और अभी recently जो फाटा की इनकी amalgamation हुई थी under the 25th amendment, उसमें NFC का share calculate करना था. I worked on that too. And I have a student who's working on a very interesting research paper, his MPhil thesis. वो उसका MPhil thesis ये है कि वो देख रहा है कि नॉर्थ वजीरिस्तान में ये जो दो पैरेलल सिस्टम्स चल रहे हैं, एक अभी भी जरगा का है और फिर दूसरा इन्होंने वहाँ पे कोर्ट्स वगैरह का जो सिस्टम लाने की कोशिश की है. what has happened to the people, मतलब वहाँ पे क्या कोई बेहतरी आई है नहीं आई. There are certain things in your presentation that I would like to, I wouldn't say disagree, but I would say that needs more of a query. Now, while doing work on, इसमें बहुत सी myths है. Myths एक तो ये है कि वहाँ पे development funds, मिसाल के तौर पे एक बड़ी myth है कि वहाँ पे development funds नहीं जाते. But in fact, when I was doing this research and I stumbled upon a lot of data, and even that data which is off the books. अब गवर्नर होता था एक वक्त में, उसके पास फंड होते थे, वो जितने मर्जी फंड होते थे वो एलोकेट कर देता था. फिर उधर जो जितने भी अब जो डीसीज कमिश्नर्स वगैरह उधर वो उस वक्त पॉलिटिकल एजेंट्स होते थे, उनके पास अच्छे खासे पैसे होते थे खर्च करने के लिए. If I did a 5-year, 10-year analysis, or pair, I did talk to a few people, and off the books, off the record, उन्होंने मुझे कुछ बता भी दिया कि जी ये इतने पैसे हैं कि जो unofficially spent हुए उसमें. So per capita वहाँ पे जो expenditure हुआ है, in fact you'd be surprised कि वहाँ पे जो per capita expenditure है in many years and decades, वो वहाँ पे दूसरे सूबों से ज्यादा था, कम नहीं था. It's not that issue ये है कि आपने जिस तरह बात करें कि वहां पे हमने एक वो मीडिएटर बिठाया हुआ था, मलिक हो गया या उसका कबीले का सरदार हो गया. ज्यादातर पैसा अगर 100 रुपए थे, 100 रुपए में 90 रुपए वो अपने पास रख ले, 10 रुपए जो है वो बाकी उस पर खर्च करता था. वहां पे ये इशू था. दूसरा इशू ये है ये कि इट्स नॉट के यहाँ पे एक मिथ अगेन, दूसरी ये है कि पीपल वहां पे जो है ये एक तस्वीर बनाई गई है ना, वो अंग्रेजों ने कहा था कि जी मार्शल रेसेस और ये बस लड़ाई झगड़े के लिए ठीक है, विच इज अ कंप्लीट मिथ. दे आर ट्रेडर्स बेसिकली, दे, ठीक है जी, दे बिलीव इन ट्रेड. लेकिन अब देखें, अब आपने 40 साल से एक पॉलिसी ये रखी हुई है कि जी अफगानिस्तान और वहाँ पे बॉर्डर जो है इट शुडंट बी क्लोज्ड, और लोग आ रहे हैं उनको आप इंकरेज करें कि आए इधर बसें. एंड वन फाइन मॉर्निंग आपको अमेरिका से टेलीफोन आता है, वो कहते तो आप वहाँ पे फौज भिजवा देते हैं, वो कहते हैं बॉर्डर बंद कर दो. तो दैट इज व्हाट गेव राइज टू द कॉन्फ्लिक्ट. थर्ड इशू, आप ये कह रहे हैं कि वहां पे ये मिलिटेंट्स ने सारे ट्राइबल एल्डर्स को कत्ल किया. इसकी कोई ऑथेंटिसिटी नहीं है कि किसने कत्ल किया. ठीक है, सही है. अब मजीद बात नहीं कर सकते कि मैं और आप उठाई जाएंगे तो. ठीक है, सही. वो राइट, ओके, वन और टू थिंग्स. आई नो जी. अच्छा, और एक दो और चीजें आपने, लेकिन इफ यू गो इनटू द हिस्टोरिकल कॉन्टेक्स्ट, ब्रिटिशर्स ऐसा नहीं है कि उन्होंने इनको अमेलगमेट करने की कोशिश नहीं की थी. 1904 में उन्होंने एक ऑलरेडी उनका वो था कि जी इनको NWFP में अमेलगमेट कर ले. फिर देन इन 1975 नसीरुल्लाह बाबर कमेटी की रिपोर्ट थी कि इनको जो है NWFP के साथ मिला लिया जाए. लेकिन देन द आर्मी केम, मार्शल लॉ केम, एंड दैट स्कपर्ड दैट अरेंजमेंट. तो किसी और का फायदा है, उनका फायदा जो है उनका फायदा नहीं है. वो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट प्रोन नहीं है या वॉर प्रोन नहीं है. अभी आप कुरम एजेंसी में देख ले, उनका मसला जो है इस्लाम नहीं है, उनका मसला है कि जमीन की किसी के टाइटल नहीं है जमीन के, वो जमीनों पे लड़ रहे हैं कि किसकी जमीन है. ठीक है, राइट. सो दीज आर सम ऑफ द इश्यूज. थैंक यू.
I think these are extremely valuable. I think you've taken note on these. These are nuances. And actually, maybe Rinchan, you can respond to some of these. My sense, maybe you would agree, is that none of these actually contradicts our result. They add those nuances. In fact, we will look at this data on development differences. In fact, our argument is not that these two regions were different in terms of development spending or in terms of development outcomes. We also show in our paper that there is a broad balance in terms of infrastructure provision. There are differences in development on average, but on the border, we don't find huge differences in infrastructure. On the income, absolutely, that's why we argue that the military operations actually act as income shocks. And obviously, there was trade all along, and the moving to the border is, so I think these are all interesting nuances, which I think do not take away the primary empirical edifice. In fact, all of these add interesting nuances to it. In fact, most of your explanations are really about those institutional differences, right? That you are not allowing local people, those institutions of conflict management that could have channelized these concerns, right? Even in SWAT, for example, the recent increase in militancy or effort to, increase militancy backfired because people rose up, right? And so as long as you have some institutions, some popular mobilization, some institutions of conflict management, those grievances are channelized and there's some pushback. But so there's a reason why these regions have been kept in in a state of institutional void. But we'll follow up with you more. Please.
Land titles and insecure property rights. Part of our explanation is, in fact, in these areas there were fewer institutions of conflict management. There's lower trust in various formal institutions of the state. So that in itself kind of creates insecure property rights, right? And conflict over land quickly devolves into more serious conflict because you don't have the proper institutions that can regulate conflict over land. So again, that ties nicely into kind of our framework, which is in areas के अंदर ही जो seemingly property disputes that could be effectively addressed through the court system, we find that that's more difficult in these areas, and even that could lead to more generalized violence. Although that's not our kind of dependent variable. Our dependent variable is really sovereignty contesting forms of violence, but it kind of in the broader framework it kind of addresses that as well. So taken on board every comment that you give.
Maybe we could combine 3 or 4 questions so that we can then respond to everyone. So maybe with Farhan.
Thank you for a very fascinating, very insightful paper. My question was about how do you characterize an external shock? So in your paper, you see post-2001 leading to social disorder and the onset of conflict. And I was just thinking about the earlier shock, which was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And the data shows that during the 70s and the 80s, there was social stability. There was no conflict. So how does that compare, that shock compare with the with the 2001 shock?
Yeah.
Or maybe we need to think more about the nature of the shock itself and speak about how that fits in to the onset.
It's a great question. We've tried to address it in our own humble way. Rinchan will respond to that. Yes, please. Can you please introduce yourself also?
Sure. My name is Kaisar Iqbal. I work at the Planning Commission. मेरी आपसे last year मुलाकात हुई थी हमारे Dr. Adnan के साथ.
Thank you.
I'm from GB. So it's good to see Dr. Rinchan Mirza finally. आज मैं आप दोनों की research थी shrines पे local economies पे उसने मेरा जो thesis था उसको की थी तो I'm very thankful again. अब जाके मैं एक और अपना जो काम कर रहा हूँ वो similar topic पे लेकिन different geographical area पे काम कर रहा हूँ तो उस पे भी अब मुझे मिल गया है कुछ ना कुछ तो I'm very thankful to you. अच्छा मेरा सवाल सर आपके कंक्लूजन से था आपने कहा था ना borderlands are more prone to violence or conflict
in the face of shocks.
Yes sir. और मेरा सवाल सर उससे जो आपने रीजंस तो बताए हैं वो तो है ही हैं नजर आ रहे हैं ना क्योंकि वो वहाँ है कॉन्फ्लिक्ट यहाँ पर आपको पंजाब के बॉर्डर जो दोनों तरफ खींचे गए वहाँ पर वो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट आपको नहीं मिलता लेकिन उस तरफ मिलता है तो मेरा सर सवाल ये है कि क्या वो जो एक कॉलोनियल अपरेटस था कॉलोनियल प्रोजेक्ट था कि कहाँ हमने बॉर्डर ड्रॉ करने क्या वो अननेचुरल थे जिसकी वजह से ये कॉन्फ्लिक्ट का शिकार हुए हैं कि उनको मैं भी उनके जो जैसे कि रिसोर्सेज के हेड्स थे वाटर हेड्स थे या वाटर जो जहाँ से पानी आता फर्श का एक रिसोर्स है उनसे उनको तोड़ा गया है कि इसकी वजह से ये मैं भी कॉन्फ्लिक्ट की तरफ जा रहे हैं या नहीं या सिर्फ और सिर्फ यही वजह है आपके ख्याल में
Great question. Thank you. Maybe one question from here, I'll come back. Yes. Just turn on.
So wonderful presentation. This is Azwar from PIDE. So you talked about institution. My question closely relates with what Rinchan was saying, but I would slightly disagree with it because to our understanding, what we had formal institution, for them it might not be the case. The institutions develop on the basis of the trust that people have in the institutions.
On the basis of interest.
The trust.
The trust.
Trust. So so let me. I just want to read it in a way. The FATA and frontier region had institution that dates back to like 400 to 500 years back, which was informal from our understanding, but to them, those were formal institutions. So how do you account for those institutions in your study? Because if you compare those with the other regions, they might have courts, they do have institutions which are like revenue courts, all the formal institutions that we really have in our mind, but to them, the JIRGA is the proper formal form of institution they had in the FATA. So when you talk about institution, you really have to be careful how you're defining the institutions and how do you define the trust that they inherit in those institutions.
Okay, great. Question there.
Hello, my name is Asif. I'm an MPhil student here at PIDE and I hail from FATA. So it's good to see someone talking about Fatah here. I want to understand how you operationalize the concept of sovereignty, particularly to the conflict zones, because the post 9/11 scenario presents an interesting case in a way that sovereignty does not have a single locus. We always attach sovereignty to the state. But if we look at the situation in those conflict areas, there is this contestation over sovereignty, because government is not the only body of sovereignty. If we let's say, take the APS incident, Taliban ने उसको इसलिए justify किया, which is not justifiable by any means, कि उन्होंने हमारे बच्चों के साथ ये किया है, तो हम उन बच्चों के साथ ये कर रहे हैं ताकि वो समझ सके कि बच्चों के साथ इस तरह जुल्म करना क्या होता है. And when Nawaz Sharif went there, along with all the parties, और वो जब वहाँ पे बैठा तो उसने मिलिट्री कोर्ट्स के लिए सेम यही जस्टिफिकेशन यूज की, क्योंकि उन्होंने हमारे बच्चों के साथ ही किया, तो हम उनको सबक सिखाने के लिए मिलिट्री कोर्ट्स कर रहे हैं और उनको हम सजाएं देंगे. So this contestation over sovereignty जो एक सिर्फ स्टेट तक महदूद नहीं होती, how does this operationalize in your research?
Okay, great. I will respond to that. Maybe another question here. Yeah. Yeah.
अगर आप अपने एनालिसिस में पेशावर को शामिल करते हैं,
सही.
So do you think that it would change something, or would there be a clear difference, or there would be no difference?
Sahi, very good question. All excellent questions. Maybe one more while we are at it.
Wonderful presentation. This is Muhammad Ishan. I work at PIDE. Do you think that foreign aid is a significant driver of scale of the conflict in the frontier region? And do you think that in the absence of foreign aid, the scale of conflict would be much less compared to its present scale? Thank you.
Great. Now, I know I have been doing a lot of talking, and the easy task, the difficult task I'll give to Rinchan. But Rinchan, maybe with your permission, I'll very quickly, if you like to question about sovereignty, that's very much part of our explanation that these regions have partial sovereignty, because historically as well, the state's presence was limited, and the state shared its power over coercion and control to local elites as well. So these are all hybrid spaces. Most borderland regions are hybrid institution spaces, as people describe it. The question about informal and formal, nowhere in our analysis we say that these are inefficient institutions or they are not functioning. In fact, they were functioning. That's why there was social order for a long period of time. But they are informal institutions because they are not, governed through. I mean, there's obviously some broad state oversight, but they're primarily informal institutions. The maximum you could say they're hybrid institutions because there's some supervision by the state. It's not that these institutions don't work. It's just that it makes the order fragile because it very much depends on these elites. The moment those elites are removed from the picture, there is more likely to be more disruption, because it's the singular pillar on which it is standing. Maybe Rinchan, your question about Afghan war is absolutely central, and we've addressed it in our paper through a variety of arguments. One of the arguments is that obviously for people to organize collectively and to challenge the state, some pre-existing institutional structures, like some ways in which people could mobilize existed. We know the Haqqani group operated there. There are many other groups operated there. But there's a fundamental difference in the way in which the two shocks can be described. The first shock, which is the 79 invasion of Afghanistan, or even before, that shock, we don't see a real disjunction between the tribal elites or local populations and others, because you were really dealing with an alien power, Russia, which is attacking Afghanistan. So you don't see that sort of anti-state sentiment per se. But the 9/11 really hit in part because of this historical precedent, because people were already aligned and they saw this war as really a US war. They did not own that war. And that's where some of this anti-state sentiment comes into play. But maybe Rinchan can explain a bit more on some of these points if you want.
Yeah, no, my point was really to kind of define more precisely the shock. So 9/11 for us, or more in precise terms, the invasion of Afghanistan for us is a shock because you have, after that on US insistence, and also cajoling, you might say, the military moving into these areas to just dominate the space and ensure border security, right? But just the presence of the military in an area which even the British found it very hard to kind of, just go and dominate the space. If you read the archives, it's very clear that even the British were very reluctant to kind of go in and dominate the space, so to speak. So I think that factor for us is really what distinguishes the 9/11 shock or the US invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11 from the earlier shock, which was, a very different nature of that. Yeah, and in our framework, that's kind of what really is the kind of driving force behind what happens later on in terms of conflict. And then the question on, what type of institutions there were and how different they were from the more, like directly controlled districts. I think our argument is not really that these areas did not have institutions. They certainly had their own informal institutions like the Khasadars or the tribal Malik system and so on and so forth. And again, when you look at the archives, it's quite clear that the British were at pains to kind of regulate conflict in these areas and keep these areas more peaceable, because these were the areas they initially faced a lot of resistance themselves, the British forces. So they developed, sophisticated kind of forms of informal institutions. But our argument really is like, when you look at modern day institutions that, come out of the Westphalian state, like things like courts or things like the district commissioner, and even local elections. KPK, the directly controlled districts, I don't know how many of you know, did have partial enfranchisement elections based on partial franchise, not full suffrage, but partial suffrage, even in the colonial period. So even way back, these areas did have some form of representative bodies at the local level. So our argument really is that full panoply of institutions never really existed or persisted in these areas for long enough for them to have, kind of those pressure valves. It's almost, if you can think of institutions as pressure valves. When you build pressure onto a system, you give it a pressure valve, and then, kind of, that's how you regulate conflict. But if there's no pressure valve and you keep building the pressure on the system breaks, so to speak. So I think that's more argument there. But I think there's an important question on foreign aid. I think we haven't really entirely looked at that, but maybe you have an answer.
No, it's a great question. And one way we can think about it is precisely by linking, Rinchan, to your point about the Pakistani military moving into the space on US insistence. And traditionally, the Pakistani military was not trained to do counterinsurgency. So at that time, General Tariq Khan was the head of, I think, IGFC, and the US gave probably $50 million or something to train the Pakistani military, prepare it for counterinsurgency. So there was an aid component. Now, what precise effect it would have had is something we have to explore. We have to think about. But clearly, this move of the Pakistani military to that space was very much supported diplomatically, but also financially. In fact, many of even the military operations that were carried out were key requirements by the United States. General Kiani's military operation was supported by the US, very much prodded by the US to engage. So clearly, you cannot distinguish that effect. But I don't think it fundamentally takes away from the things that we are trying to explain, because that it is just a mechanical thing, the way the violence unfolds. the underlying institutional fragilities were already there that was activated after the 9/11 shock. So maybe we could bring this to a close if there's another question here.
I do have a few questions. In your presentation, you have not taken into account frontier governmentality in Balochistan. After all, it was also managed as a buffer zone for a long time, and it became a province in 1970. I would like your take on that. The other question is like, as I understand, probably you are saying that colonial institutions were beneficial. And what if the colonial institutions would have been extended into these areas with whole extractive institutions along with that as well, extractive machinery? What would have been the case? I mean, there was a differential system between colonies and homeland as well. So what about that? Another question is about, you're saying that it is after 9/11 that they considered a shock. I mean, Soviet shock has already been mentioned, but could it be the reason that it was heavily militarized during Afghan jihad that we saw what the repercussions were? I mean, the other frontier regions, especially Balochistan, also had a lot of refugee population, but it was not that heavily militarized that resulted in that kind of conflict that happened after 9/11 in the frontier regions. What's your take on that?
All three excellent questions. Rinchan, you would like to address some of those? I mean, I think, so the first question about Balochistan is obviously relevant, but I think Balochistan went in and out of that arrangement, right? In fact, even some areas like DG Khan were, and in fact, large parts of KP, large parts of Pakistan were under frontier rule, and they were gradually taken away. For our analysis, we have to focus on regions that have consistently remained in that arrangement for the effect to study.
When looking at Balochistan, and we try to think about the difference, you're absolutely right that there was an institutional void there as well, in the sense the Sandeman system and, like the kind of limited role of the state there. But I think there's a fundamental difference there in the Baloch areas, is that there is, society is less egalitarian when compared to FATA. FATA societies is composed primarily of tribes that are quite egalitarian in their approach, right? It's not as hierarchical as some of those other parts where there was an institutional void, but then the kind of the tribal leaders were more in control of things, so to speak. So I think when we talk about fragility of a system, I think it was more fragile in an environment where the local social hierarchy itself is quite egalitarian, and then it kind of becomes aggrieved after some kind of state action. So kind of the local dynamics of how tribes were organized matters, and the difference between the Baloch side and these kind of areas matters in our framework as well.
This is, I mean, the great thing about this setting is that it's not just a story of extractive institutions. Typically, when you talk of elites or institutions, they're very extractive institutions. Here the elites are egalitarian, which is in a way good for us because we can then rule out the kind of Acemoglu-Robinson type of extractive elite setting. There's also been some work by Nathan Nunn on the role of segmentary lineage on conflict. And again, if you read anthropological work in this area, segmentary lineage is not, the prime thing here. Is not a key confounding factor. Similarly, ethnicity is similar, Pathans on both sides, religion is similar. So that gives you, a very nice comparable setting. Institutions now, yeah. So
no, but if the formal institutions would have been established in the frontier regions, they would have come with all of that extractive machinery as well that we saw in Punjab or Sindh or other areas. So that I am talking about.
Yeah, sure. So we accept that colonialism in South Asia was quite extractive, right?
Yeah.
By its very essence, by its very nature. What we're trying to argue is within that extractive setup, overall extractive setup of South Asia, there were significant differences in levels of
Subnational variation.
Subnational variation. So in some areas you had, but even in that extractive setup, if you see, if you compare British colonialism to French colonialism, or you compare it to Spanish colonialism, you find a significant difference. The Spanish colonial powers in Latin America were much more regressive. They were much more extractive, absolutist. Their brutality towards local population was much higher. The overall, I'm talking about comparing two evils, right? Which is the lesser of the two evil. But the British colonialism had a very important aspect. They were always concerned about keeping the peace. And they tried different ways of keeping the peace by sometimes giving elections, some very limited representation, or some provision of district administration, and some state capacity on the ground.
Especially,
But that was missing in these areas, and that's
No,
our
I
concern.
mean,
And
there was a
also-
question, I guess, from Azwar, where it was mentioned that where you are mentioning informal institutions, I can, if write an equation, colonial institutions can be called formal institutions, and local institutions are informal. I mean, the Adivasis or the Chakma tribe never had that kind of apparatus. They had kind of sovereignty. They never experienced that kind of, you can say, rule where they were subjected to something. Similarly, the frontier regions were never proper subjects, and blue people were also not proper subjects. They were they had kind of sovereignty, partial sovereignty. So probably that is also the reason of those sovereignty contested conflicts.
Something we
Dr.
can.
Saab, can we have this conversation outside, because it's almost buses have to leave and people have to
Oh,
leave.
okay,
right?
great. So we'll just close it here on your Afghan period, the Afghan war period. Those effects, exactly. So that cannot be ruled out, but those structures were there. And clearly the shock unlocked some of those. You must have built on those, but they were not the primary driver for conflict. But they cannot be ruled out as key antecedent conditions. But great. I really wanted to thank everyone for a fabulous conversation. I was really impressed with the quality of questions we had. Excellent questions. It goes to say something about the way this institution is being managed and the way in which our public sector.
This was a wonderful presentation on a wonderful subject. Not a lot of people talk about it. It's a wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.